The first ping arrived before dawn, and Armand stared as the balance bled red. He had scrubbed her card last week, yet the auto bill marched through like a ghost with keys. He whispered, "No way." The kitchen light flickered, and the phone buzzed again. A second fee stacked like a falling tile. The narrator noted how certainty can crack at the edges first. "Oh," Armand said. "Sarah closed it. I know she did." He remembered the cafe and her steady voice. Sarah said, "Boundaries, Armand. I need a clean break." He believed her then. Now numbers told another truth. He called the bank and held through tinny music. The agent said, "It was linked to your checking, sir." Armand said, "So she closed my card, but her bill still found me." Silence grew teeth, and the day began. The narrator traced Armand's ordinary strengths, because ordinary strengths break first. He was meticulous with budgets and sloppy with hope. He wanted fairness. And he wanted it fast. He loved rules until they bent against him. Armand said, "We agreed on boundaries." He had built a spreadsheet like a lighthouse, row by row. Sarah said, "We can be civil, but we need space." He agreed, but he kept paying for quiet conveniences no one thanked. The overdraft felt like a hand in his pocket and a shrug in return. He scrolled through old chats and saw politeness hiding blunt edges. He wondered if civility was only a prettier lock on the same door. He stood in the kitchen and decided to follow the money's footprints. He dialed again and let procedure do its slow dance. The agent read disclaimers like a lullaby for panic. Armand said, "You told me the card is closed." The agent said, "Yes, but the merchant token points at checking." He pictured a keyhole, no one seal. He asked for a reversal, and policy stood up like a wall. The agent said, "I can file a dispute." Armand said, "File it, and flag the merchant." The narrator watched him learn a new vocabulary for hurt. He repeated dates with calm precision, and wrote the case number on an envelope. Numbers steadied his hands, even when trust failed. He texted first, and then called, because silence has its own fees. Sarah answered with a sigh that carried years. Sarah said, "I closed what you asked." Armand said, "Your auto bill still hit me." She paused, and the pause ran long. Sarah said, "That must be a system lag." He felt the word lag settle like dust on a spill. Armand said, "Then help me clean it." Her voice thinned, and the narrator heard distance pretending to be calm. Sarah said, "I'll check later." The later felt like never wearing a clock. He kept his tone steady and asked for a deliberate fix. The line went quiet, and the call ended without a promise. By evening the rain thinned to threads, and the city exhaled. Armand sorted documents into piles like little verdicts. He found the clause about merchant tokens, and traced it twice. He heard his father's voice from years ago. Father said, "Receipts remember when people forget." Armand smiled without joy, and opened a new note. He titled it with the date and the fee. He wrote steps, not feelings, because steps carry you forward. The narrator said he wanted justice, not theater. He would visit the branch at first light, and ask for the token severed. He closed the laptop and let the room go dark. The storm had moved, but the ground stayed wet. Dawn found Armand outside the branch, where damp concrete held the night's breath. The narrator watched him rehearse facts like vows. Armand said, "Card closed last week, yet the merchant still drew." He carried copies, clipped true. Doors slid open with a hush that felt like verdicts approaching. A teller smiled, then flattened at the story's hinge. Armand said, "Unlink the merchant token from checking." The teller said, "That needs back office approval and a form." Bureaucracy arranged its chairs. He signed where arrows pointed, and wrote the date twice. The narrator noted how hope survives inside exact handwriting. A supervisor appeared with a polite shield. Supervisor said, "Tokens survive card closures if the merchant vaulted routing." Armand said, "Then sever it now." Time stretched like gum on a shoe, and patience frayed but held. They led Armand to a glass cubicle where whispers seemed to hang like cobwebs. The narrator detailed the forms that promise relief while charging rent to time. Manager said, "We need a written revocation to stop the mandate." Armand said, "Here is my revocation." Manager said, "There is also a stop payment fee." He remembered the overdraft and felt the fee bite again. Armand said, "Bill me once more for protection then." The manager blinked at the edge of a smile not given. She outlined timelines and disclaimers with neat breaths. Armand repeated, "Sever the token, flag the merchant, and confirm in writing." The narrator heard resolve harden into crisp consonants. He paid, signed, and kept the receipt like a small shield. Back home, Armand called the merchant and met a recorded smile. The narrator marked each option pressed like steps in a maze. Agent said for billing, confirmed the last 4 digits. Armand said, "I am the payer on checking, not the card." Agent said, "Primary owner is Sarah, we need her consent." He steadied his breath and chose the narrow path. Armand said, "I revoke authorization for debits from my account." He asked for a confirmation email and a case number. The agent read a script that turned apology into mist. Agent said, "Processing may take up to 2 cycles." The narrator named the risk aloud in the room's silence. Another attempt could arrive before the cut. Armand wrote the time and braced the ledger. He texted Sarah because the bridge still existed and might still hold. The narrator framed his words like careful packages. "You," Armand said, "update your payment today. The token is being severed." Sarah said, "You are making this ugly." He tasted the old ache under new varnish. Armand said, "This is boundary, not spite." Sarah said, "I closed what you asked, you keep moving the goalpost." He looked at the fee line and counted to 10. Armand said, "Next debit will fail and return. Fix your billing." Silence answered first, then a single tremor of dots. Sarah said, "I will look when I can." The narrator heard a door close without a click. He saved the thread and set alerts like small sentries. Evening returned with the smell of damp dust and hot wires. The narrator counted safeguards as Armand built them. He set account alerts to scream before dawn. He drafted a dispute letter with dates lined like guards. Armand said, "Case number here, revocation attached, stop payment confirmed." He printed 2 copies and signed with deliberate pressure. A notification blinked from the bank, a pre-auth probe that died on contact. He felt both relief and the tremor of collateral shock. Armand said, "Tomorrow they will try again, and the branch will see it." He placed the folder by the door like a packed bag. The city hummed, and the room narrowed to paper and breath. The narrator named it plainly. The conflict had momentum now. By sunrise, the account alerts stacked like dominoes daring a finger. The narrator measured Armand's breath as he opened each notice with steady hands. Armand said, "Pre-auth attempts at 5:41 and 6:3. The bank's fraud desk answered with practiced calm and useful distance. Analyst said, "The token still pings your checking despite card closure." Armand said, "Stop the next debit at the gate." Analyst said, "A hard block is active, but merchants sometimes retreat in bursts." He pictured a stubborn key scratching the same lock. The narrator marked how procedure can feel like mercy when it finally moves. Armand said, "Document every ping and send me the log." Analyst said, "You will receive a transcript within the hour." Hope rose, cautious and exact. He set coffee to boil and watched the window gather rain. At work, fluorescent noon drew pale borders around worries that would not fit. The narrator followed Armand to payroll like a shadow with paperwork. Our manager said, "Your deposit posted," then a temporary hold flagged risk. Armand said, "The bank blocked a bad debit, not my wages." Our manager said, "The system reads only status, not story." He nodded and slid the dispute letter across the desk. Armand said, "Please annotate my file so the hold does not repeat." Notice time stretched out. I will add it and email payroll operations. A colleague hovered with quiet concern. Naveed said, "You okay, man?" Arman said, "Fixing a leak before it becomes a flood." The narrator saw steadiness win a small room. A reply chimed, and the hold cleared like fog in sun. The afternoon brought a call that tasted like rust. The narrator kept the line taut as old grievances tugged. Armand said, "Your merchant is still aimed at my checking." Sarah said, "I changed it last week, I swear." He kept his tone narrow as a ledger line. Armand said, "Their agent names you as primary, and the token points at me." Sarah said, "You are punishing me with technicalities." He breathed once and set the boundary upright. Armand said, "This is consent and money, not theater." Silence tried to take the room. Sarah said, "I will look tonight. I am busy." He nodded at a voice that could not see him. The narrator felt the distance become policy. Armand said, "Send me confirmation when done." The call ended without a shape to hold. The bank transcript arrived like a flashlight beam. The narrator read over Armand's shoulder as timestamp stitched a pattern. Armand said, 3 retries within 90 minutes. He emailed the merchant's compliance address with the revocation attached. Armand said, "You are on notice, further attempts are unauthorized." Compliance officer said, "We acknowledge receipt and will purge the token." He asked for a purge confirmation ID and a deadline. Compliance officer said, "Id issued, purge within 24 hours." He logged the promise with the patience of a clock. The narrator admired the way facts can be armor when feelings fail. Armand said, "If you miss the window, fees are on you." The reply paused, then agreed in precise language. Paper became a shield again. Dusk turned to an ink that forgot the edges of things. The narrator watched Armand chart risk like weather. He mapped accounts, set alerts to high, and listed contacts by urgency. Armand said, "Bank fraud, branch manager, merchant compliance, payroll." A new ping flashed and died on the block. He felt the tug and did not move. Armand said, "Documented and time-stamped." He texted Naveed a thanks for the daylight help. "Naveed," said, "doors hold better with hinges oiled." He almost smiled and went back to the ledger. The city's lights trembled on wet streets and steadied. The narrator placed the day in a folder labeled Proof. Tomorrow would test the hinges. The 24-hour promise expired at 7:02 a.m., and a new attempt scraped the gate. The narrator watched Armand open the log like a surgeon opening a chart. Armand said, "They tried again at 7:01. The block held, but a fee still blinked away. He called the branch and asked for the supervisor with the careful voice. "Supervisor," said, "our system assessed a retry fee despite the block." Armand said, "Reverse it and note the purge miss." A pause spread like frost along a wire. "Supervisor," said, "I see an internal note about an account updater." He pictured a hidden corridor that bypassed his lock. Armand said, "Explain the corridor in writing." The supervisor's tone flattened to policy and steps. The narrator named it clearly. Truth arrived wearing jargon, but its shape was betrayal. The compliance reply landed with a neat subject and a heavier subtext. The narrator traced each sentence like a wire across a dark room. Compliance officer said, "Token purged, but a secondary funding source remained active." Armand said, "Who added the secondary source and when?" The cursor blinked as if it feared the answer. Compliance officer said, "Added 6 months ago by household member, credentials." His breath cooled and memory warmed too fast. Armand said, "Attach audit trail and confirm revocation applies to all sources." The officer promised an attachment and a timestamp. The narrator felt the floor tilt toward an old argument. The file arrived, stamped and bleak. The lines told him what trust had not. He asked to meet where receipts outnumbered excuses. The narrator set them at a cafe with rain drying on chairs. Armand said, "You added my checking as backup 6 months ago." Sarah said, I set it once to keep the service from lapsing. He held the printout, like a quiet flare. Armand said, "You left it active after you closed my card." Sarah said, "I forgot after the fight," and the bills kept clearing. Forgetting carried the taste of convenience. Armand said, "You remembered the service but not consent." Her eyes hardened, then softened to fog. Sarah said, "I was drowning, and the autopay was a rope. The rope had pulled him under." The narrator let the silence make its record. Armand returned to the desk and dialed the network's token service. The narrator measured each clause he stacked like bricks. Armand said, "Revoke all vaults tied to my routing and name." Specialist said, "A card closure does not cancel merchant updaters." He asked for the purge scope and the proof string. Specialist said, "We can issue a universal revocation ID." He wrote it twice and circled it once. Armand said, "Notify every processor that pings this ID." Specialist said, "Propagation may lag across gateways." He accepted delay without surrendering leverage. The narrator watched him send the ID to bank and merchant. Paper and integers marched in step. The loophole had a lid now. Night pooled in the corners, while the inbox lit its own weather. The narrator followed a forwarded thread from months ago. "Service bot," said primary card declined, using backup source. The warning had arrived on a quiet Tuesday. Armand said, "You saw this and stayed silent." Sarah said, "I told myself it was temporary." Temporary had grown roots and a mouth. He filed the thread with the case notes and closed the folder. Armand said, "Any further debit will be treated as unauthorized." The city hummed beyond the glass like a generator that never sleeps. The narrator named the new terrain. Trust had fractured, and the map redrew in real time. The audit file arrived with more than timestamps. It carried fingerprints. The narrator watched Armand open the attachment and freeze on a device tag. Analyst said, "Credential source. Pixel 5, Armand, home IPT." Memory rose like heat from asphalt. Armand said, "That is my phone." The room tilted and steadied on a single night. 6 months passed. He saw rain, a deadline, a service warning pulsing red. Sarah said, "If this lapses, I lose access before delivery." He had typed quickly and chosen the nearest fix. Armand said, "Use my checking as backup tonight. We will undo it tomorrow." Tomorrow had traveled too far. The narrator named the twist without mercy. The backup was his idea, and time kept it alive. He closed his eyes, then opened them on the ledger. Truth once found demands a new math. The narrator opened the door to that night and let the storm blow in. The power had flickered, and a service countdown gnawed at the corner of the screen. Sarah said 5 minutes until lockout. He felt urgency like a wire in his teeth. Armand said, "Borrow my backup, ship your files, sleep after." She typed with the ferocity of someone outrunning doubt. He confirmed routing while the monsoon pressed its wet face to the glass. Armand said, "Temporary, I promise." Sarah said, "We will fix it at first light." First Light never asked them to keep the promise. The night delivered her deadline, then kept his account as collateral. The narrator folded the scene back into now, and left the thunder outside. He met Sarah in the same cafe where boundaries once sounded tidy. The narrator set the printout between them like a mirror. Armand said, "The backup came from my device." Sarah's shoulders dropped as if the chair had eased a knot. Sarah said, "I searched how to undo, and then we fought. I let it drift." He nodded and let the admission land without glee. Armand said, "I own the start, but not the months of silence." Sarah said, "I owe the follow-through." The coffee steamed and failed to warm the distance. Armand said, "We correct it together, then we end the entanglement." She lifted the pen before he could offer it. The narrator watched two truths share a table, and not cancel each other. Procedure turned from shield to tool in his hands. The narrator listened as Armand stitched the agencies together with the revocation ID. Armand said. Bank merchant network. Same document, same clock. Manager said, fees will be reversed upon confirmation receipt. Compliance officer said, purge completed, secondary and updated disabled. He requested a goodwill credit for the overdraft where. Manager said, approved as courtesy given shared error. Sarah said, send me the final letter, I will archive it too. He forwarded the packet and time-stamped the send. The ledger, once an accusation, became a record of repair. The narrator allowed a small breath to enter the room without apology. Night returned with fewer edges, but sharper meaning. The narrator watched Armand draft the message that did not gloat or grovel. Armand said, we are square, and we stay separate. He listed subscriptions and closed every shared hinge. Sarah said, thank you for the clean exit. He replied with a receipt and nothing ornamental. The past lifted like humidity after rain, still present, less heavy. He saved the audit file in a folder named Lessons and locked it. Armand said, I fix what I break, and I guard what I keep. Outside, scooters hissed through shallow puddles and carried on. The story had not forgiven itself, but it had learned its shape. Morning brought a new kind of silence, the sort that arrives when the machinery has stopped. The narrator followed Armand to his desk where no alerts waited. He opened his bank dashboard and scrolled slowly, searching for pings. Armand said, no retries in 12 hours. The fraud analyst confirmed on the phone, merchant token no longer active, updater purged. Armand said, close the watch list, but keep the notes. He leaned back, the chair creaking like a joint after strain. The narrator marked the moment as not victory, but a clearing in weather. He sipped coffee without glancing at his phone. Armand said, we keep our own locks now. The city's morning hum seeped through the window, not urgent, just there. The narrator found him walking through the market at noon, phone zipped in pocket, hands free. Armand picked vegetables with a deliberation usually reserved for line items. Naveed called from across the aisle, no alarms today. Armand said, nothing in the red. Naveed smiled, the kind that measures someone against yesterday. The air smelled of coriander and rain-damp burlap. Vendors shouted prices, coins clicked in trays. Armand's eyes lingered on the balance of weight in each bag. The narrator knew he was counting, but not money, counting days without intrusion. He handed exact change, felt its smooth departure, and thought of how some exits are meant to be permanent. In the branch lobby a different meeting waited. The narrator placed him before the supervisor who had once spoken in policy armor. Supervisor said, all reversals posted, and goodwill credit issued. Armand said, noted and appreciated. He handed her a printed thank you letter, short and specific. Supervisor said, we rarely get closure in writing. Armand said, it keeps the record whole. The handshake was brief but unflinching. The narrator called it an exchange between two custodians, one of money, the other of proof. He left with nothing new in his account, but something restored in his balance. Outside, the street noise was suddenly welcome. Sarah's name appeared one last time on his phone. The narrator listened as her voice crossed the distance, like someone walking on wet stone. Sarah said, I cleared my side today. Armand said, good. She hesitated, then added, thank you for fixing what I let drag. He said, we both did. The call was brief, free of knots. They didn't promise to stay in touch, they promised nothing at all. The narrator heard no bitterness, only the sound of a ledger closing on both sides. He set the phone down without replaying the words. Some endings, he knew, are tidy only in how they stop. Night draped itself over the city with no urgency. The narrator found Armand on the balcony, the air smelling of cooled asphalt. Below, headlights drew lines on wet streets. He scrolled through his lessons folder, then locked the phone and left it inside. Armand said, not every fix feels like triumph, but it feels like mine. He rested arms on the railing, breathing in a rhythm that no alarm would break. In the distance a shop shutter clanged down, final for the day. He turned toward the dark room and the comfort of things that were only his. The narrator let the scene hold without moving it forward. Some chapters end by staying still. The narrator began the last day with the smell of fresh rain and cardamom tea drifting through the room. Armand stood at his desk, not to guard it but to clear it. He placed the lessons folder into a small lockbox, turning the key once, hearing the click settle like a punctuation mark. Armand said, "This one's closed." Outside, clouds broke, scattering white over the wet rooftops. He didn't check his phone. The absence of alerts was now its own steady companion. The window's reflection showed a man who had pulled his own hand from the fire and kept the scar as proof. The narrator knew that proof was enough. By midday, Armand walked past the bank without going in. The narrator lingered on the way, his glance slid over the glass doors without weight. He no longer carried forms, folders, or rehearsed questions. A street vendor called out for tea, and he stopped, letting the steam and sugar find him. Navid joined him, sipping from a paper cup. "Navid," said, "you're lighter." Armand said, "Dropped the ballast." They stood together watching the city's steady choreography of wheels, feet, and rainwater swirling toward the drain. The world didn't mark his victory, but it didn't have to. The absence of drag was the only trophy he needed. While. In the late afternoon, a message from Sarah arrived, short, factual, final. Sarah said, "Account unlinked on my end. Here's proof." He opened the screenshot and saw her name nowhere on his horizon. Armand replied with a simple, "Confirm." The narrator admired how no further words were needed. He archived the chat thread and muted the conversation. Outside, sunlight washed the walls gold before sliding away. He leaned back in his chair, letting the quiet settle, not as a gap, but as a presence. The problem had left without a parting shot. Some endings whisper. Evening came with a light wind carrying the scent of street food and wet dust. The narrator followed Armand onto the balcony, where the city stretched in layered lights. He lit a single candle on the railing, not for ritual, but for marking. Armand said, "To things that end." He didn't toast with anyone, but the candle's flicker felt like agreement. Cars passed below, tires hissing over damp asphalt. The ledger was closed, the key hung on its hook, and the air no longer pressed. He leaned into the railing, face toward the breeze, and let the city's noise blend into the night. The narrator left him in the final scene at his kitchen table, tea cooling beside an untouched notebook. The rain had stopped, and the world smelled rinsed. He didn't need to write what came next. Armand said, "Nothing to fix tonight." The window reflected both his face and the steady dark beyond. No alerts, no calls, no retried debits, just a clock ticking into ordinary time. He let the sound fill the room, unbroken. In the stillness the story ended, not with a door slammed, but with one left gently closed. The rest would be life, and that was enough.